Hello scholars! In this video we'll be discussing one of Miyazaki's most common themes, that is immortality and the corruptive stagnation that brings. This theme appears in all the Dark Souls games, Déraciné, Bloodborne, and now in Sekiro as well. So it's clearly an important part of Miyazaki's philosophy, but something we don't touch too deeply on in the lore community, so maybe this video can change that a little bit. As many other scholars have pointed out, in Japanese culture, stagnant bodies of water are considered sources of uncleanliness. Because a stagnant pond, or lake, or puddle, mosquitoes can safely lay their eggs in that water. Those same insects can't do that in a running river because the eggs just get washed away. In Sekiro, there are several references to stagnant blood.
Repeated use leads to stagnation. This causes those who do not have the power to become sick. A disease known as dragon rot. Blood that he's coughed up. The color of the blood itself appears to be tainted, stagnant.
And Lord Kuro, who is immortal, talks about his blood being stagnant too.
Undying begets stagnation. The immortal oath, the rejuvenating waters, the dragon rot. They all corrupt men, to the point that they no longer live as men.
But my lord, you cannot bleed.
Yes. It is true that those of the dragon's heritage cannot bleed.
With the mortal blade, you may wound the divine heir, and his blood will be allowed to flow.
So the mortal blade will allow my blood to flow.
In other words, his blood is stagnant because of his immortality. And because their blood isn't flowing and it's stagnant, that allows these parasites to kind of breed inside of their bodies and then sort of like take them over. Just as mosquitoes lay their eggs in a stagnant pond, the parasites in Sekiro lay their eggs inside of immortal individuals with stagnant blood. Or, more oddly in the shinobi's case, he himself is like a parasite. His immortality saps the life force from other individuals, and it's those people the shinobi has met who become corrupted and whose blood begins to stagnate. And it's also kind of like a metaphor. Time is stagnant for someone who is immortal. Their blood stops flowing and stagnates, so that makes them the perfect host for these centipedal parasites to nest in, lay their eggs, breed in, and eventually take over the host body and corrupt his identity and even implant in him an endless desire for more and more of the thing that brought about his own stagnation. The parasite is not the cause of the immortality, but it is instead a symptom of it and the source of that corruption and insanity and addiction. So Sekiro has really altered my view on Bloodborne, where now I think I understand where the vermin come from and how they corrupt people's identities and take control of them. People really sympathize with Gilbert, but in truth, his quest to extend his life with immortal blood is as corrupt as Genichiro's quest for immortal blood to extend the life of his doomed nation. That obsession with clinging to the past and never letting go is an immoral quest, and even Robert's father, who seeks to extend the life of his ill son, is immoral. Were he to succeed and feed the divine immortal water to his son, it would only corrupt his son, stagnate his blood, and his son would lose his autonomy and sense of self. One of my friends was criticizing the moral message in Sekiro that, immortality is this futile pursuit. He criticized that as kind of being unrelatable. Like, okay, thank you, Miyazaki, I guess I'll stop trying to pursue immortality now, because otherwise I'll get taken over by a parasite or something. But I think that's kind of missing the point. I think it has more to do with, like, a very harsh lesson that the Japanese people learned from their own history. During Japan's Sengoku period, regional leaders, or daimyo, were constantly fighting each other to take over their neighbor's territory. Sekiro hypothetically takes place during this chaotic period of Japanese history, with a few artistic liberties given.
The stages of the game will also be based on famous battles which actually took place in ancient Japan. So here's this giant enemy crab.
Immediately following the Sengoku era was a long period known as the Great Peace, or Edo period, which lasted for nearly 250 years. During this time, Japan kind of unified under the rulership of the Tokugawa clan, and most importantly, Japan adopted a policy of isolation, or sakoku, where any foreigner, save for a few exceptions, who tried to set foot in Japan would be executed. This was in reaction to the reality of European religion and expansion, which threatened to destroy Japan's self-sovereignty. So keep this in mind, Japan was attempting to cling onto and preserve its old traditions by forbidding Western ideas, technology, and development. And this worked very, very well for hundreds of years. A Dutch trader who was given special exemption said in 1621, "Edo is on most days more crowded than a public street in any of the most populous towns of Europe."
Thus began the Age of Fire.
So Japan's Edo period was unusually peaceful, ludicrously economically prosperous, the culture thrived, and the population and urban development of Japan boomed like never before. However, the consequence of Sengoku became apparent in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy arrived in Japan with 4 technologically advanced warships. In pursuit of Japan's coal and whale oil, he demanded that Japan open its ports for trade, and when he returned in 1854 with a fleet that dwarfed the previous, the shogun of Japan had little other choice than to capitulate. Other nations, including Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia, also made their own demands of the Japanese people, and the treaties the shogun was forced to sign, such as the Treaty of Kanagawa, were usually kind of unfair and unfavorable to the Japanese nation. It humiliated the Japanese people, threatened their sovereignty, and ultimately ended Japan's peaceful Edo period. I don't know. In an attempt to rival these Western nations and regain a competitive edge, an alliance of samurai overthrew the old shogunate and established the Meiji Restoration in an attempt to westernize Japan itself. The entire class structure was reorganized, military recruitment was opened up to peasants, foreigners were invited to teach at Tokyo University, the military adopted Western technology and strategy, and Japan began to expand its territorial empire across the Pacific and parts of East Asia. Again, this was all in an attempt to rival the massive and powerful empires of Britain, France, and Russia. And the national slogan during this time said,
追いつけ、追い越せ。
or catch up, overtake. Japan's aggressive expansion and rapid development solidified it as a considerable world power until 1941, when the nation attacked the American military base at Pearl Harbor, which prompted retaliation by American forces. And in August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped, one in Hiroshima, which killed 80,000 people, and another one in Nagasaki, which killed another 40,000.
戦局必ずしも好転せず、世界の体制また我に出会わず、しかのみならず敵は新たに残虐なる爆弾を使用して地形に向こうを殺傷し、残骸の及ぶところ真にかかるべかざるに至る。しかもなお応戦を継続せんか、ついに我が民族の滅亡を将来するのみならず、ひいて人類の文明をも破却すべし。核の軍馬真何を。
The Emperor of Japan surrendered, his empire was dismantled, his military was largely disbanded, and he was forced to renounce his godlike divinity, as Japanese culture had believed the emperor was a divine figure. For 200 years, Japan chose to cling onto the past, and while it was beneficial for a time, it caused the nation to stagnate, while other nations were industrializing. When the time came to confront the industrialized nations of the West, Japan was unprepared and desperately struggled to catch up both technologically and territorially. Ultimately, its self-imposed disadvantage proved to be its undoing.
But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. Even now, there are only embers, Japan sees not light, but only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark side.
Now this has all been a particularly harsh lesson for the Japanese people, so when Miyazaki places such a heavy emphasis on the corruptive power of the futile pursuit of immortality, of clinging to the past, of trying to keep things the way they are, it's just a reiteration of what the Japanese people already know firsthand. Technologically superior Americans forced Japan to open its ports in 1854, and technologically superior Americans forced Japan to surrender in 1945. So it's hardly a surprise that post-war Japan strives even harder than ever to become a great nation, not through empire building or military prowess, but through an enormous emphasis on education, innovation, and workplace productivity. Japanese schools are notoriously strict and academically demanding on their students. And even upon graduating, the Japanese workforce is so notoriously productive and work-focused that the nation is suffering a sexless epidemic where people just aren't behaving romantically or sexually with each other. In the past 10 years, Japan's population has declined by 1 million, and to make matters even worse, suicide rates are absurdly high, and heart attacks have become a medical anomaly for how they've affected Japanese young people at impossibly young ages.
Straight out of college in 2009, his son Satoshi proudly joined a prestigious manufacturer, but within a year, he was dead. Investigators said the stress of working extreme hours drove him to take his own life. The young engineer fell victim to the Japanese phenomenon of karoshi, or death from overwork. An early day for him was going home at 9 p.m., his father says. If work wasn't finished, he'd stay until midnight. Young women are just as vulnerable. This month, state broadcaster NHK revealed one of its reporters, 31-year-old Miwa Sato, had died from heart failure after working near 14-hour days.
I was reading that this Karoshi, that it started after World War II, and it was encouraged because they had to rebuild their economy, right. And so this industrious behavior, industrious nature was something that worked for them.
It's, Japan is, as many people know, my favorite country after France. I've lived there. It's a wonderful place, but that is part of the culture. It's not necessarily a boss that tells you you have to stay and work overtime.
Right.
That country went from being essentially an agrarian society in 1850 to modernizing to the point where they were able to attack the United States less than 100 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in Japan, whether you are the CEO or you're, delivering mail, is working, believes that work is part of what you're supposed to do.
And all that said, Japan's innovation and economic strength are, today, exemplary as a result of its culture. Its hyper-productivity and strong sense of national identity have created the world's third largest economy. And Miyazaki's lesson about clinging on to the past and the apocalyptic stagnation it brings is something we should all bear in mind when judging national policy in the modern world ruled by technological innovation. And however harsh it may seem that Gilbert is punished with the loss of his humanity in his quest to extend his mortal life, and however harsh it may seem that a father is shoved off a bridge in his quest to extend his own son's mortal life, both punishments are justified in the eyes of Japanese history, because to cling onto the past and stagnate the natural course of fate is a far worse and apocalyptic crime. As the Buddha teaches, everything is changeable, everything appears and disappears. There is no blissful peace until one passes beyond the agony of life, and even the agony of death. And just to emphasize, a decision that the Japanese government made hundreds of years ago and all the successive choices it made along the way, people today are still suffering the consequences of it. As in Sekiro, Genichiro literally sacrifices himself in order to summon his dead grandfather from out the grave, so that way his grandfather can kill a young lord and his shinobi protector. The older generation seeks to harm and destroy the younger. Or in Bloodborne, where a child is literally ripped out of his mother's womb to be harvested by older, immortal generations. Or in Déraciné, where scientists sacrifice a child in order to correct their own errors. The child pays for the bad decisions of the older generation. It's a tale tragically parallel with the story of Japan.